Whoa. You just click play on a Theology Nerd podcast. I hope you're ready. You want to know why? Because today, my voice, this is Trip Fuller. I'm going to talk to my friend Timothy Murphy, and we're going to be talking about his new book. Yeah. It is a post-colonial process, constructive theological understanding of the church. He was going to talk about a planetary gospel. He's going to talk about churching. He's going to talk about a lot of things. And here's the cool thing. I've now been doing this podcast almost 10 years, which means I now have friends I met early on who are finishing PhDs and writing their first books. This is one of them, Timothy Murphy. He's writing a book. It came out from Process Century Press. Conveniently, Process Century Press, they are partnering with us in the Center for Process Studies to do a giant Theology Nerd book giveaway right now, right up to almost Christmas. We're doing this giant giveaway where 5 different people are going to get 20 books worth over $800. All the books that Process Century Press put out in the last year. You're going to get all of them. Well, those 5 people will. And then the grand prize winner will get all those books plus 5 books by John Cobb, Marjorie Suhawke, and David Ray Griffin. On top of that, that's 35 theology books. And one of them is Timothy Murphy's. Right here, right now, we're discussing ecclesiology. That would be a conversation about the church. Ecclesiology is the word you learn to use when you go in debt to learn a theology. Well, Timothy is a theologian, an activist, a churchman, and a friend. So I hope you enjoy it. Before we pop in to this conversation, do remember we have this giveaway, and right now is a good time to sign up for the Make Advent Great Again class, a pop-up online community. Me, Mike, John, we're doing this class with a whole bunch of our friends. Every day throughout the Advent, you're going to get a different email with a different reflection by a different progressive Christian, thinker, minister, and such. Each week, there's going to be a live video interaction, which if you don't watch live, you can always just, experience retroactively those sessions. And then there's going to be a secret group on Facebook where you can speak life to one another, encourage each other and stuff as you go through the holidays. And plenty of us go into families, situations, meals, and things where people might not be wanting to make Advent great again, but something else. And we're saying, no, Christmas hasn't started yet. That's on December 25th. Up to that's Advent. It's a liturgical calendar season. And we're just trying to be conservative enough to make Advent awesome. We're trying to make Advent great. We want Advent to be so awesome. We're being conservative, sticking to the liturgical calendar. So we're like, Christmas, step off this. Start on the 25th. You got 12 days up to Epiphany. Stay over there. We just want to gather, collect, interact online and say, come, God, come. We know God's not fully present. God's not fully, God's will, God's desire, God's kingdom hasn't fully arrived. That the arrival of God is simultaneously a gift of grace and a gift of judgment. We know that the world as it is not as it will be. So we need to spend that time, those 4 weeks, waiting, anticipating, looking for inbreakings of love, joy, peace, hope, and turning our eyes, our ears, our mouths, our feet towards love, joy, peace, hope, so that we can participate in the coming and arrival of God. There ain't no need to get to Christmas early. So we're trying to make it great again. You can join that. Go to magadventgreatagain.com. You can join. It's free. And you can donate. Obviously, anyone can donate what they want, but we don't want anyone not coming, not having a community for money reasons. So just come on out. And I got to give a shout out to 2 new homebrewed community members. Cynthia Darnold. I just feel like you're smart. Cynthia Darnold sounds like an intelligent person. If you saw that on the top of a paper, you'd say, I anticipated a Cynthia Darnold, new elder at Homebrewed Christianity. She went to homebrewedcommunity.com. She gets $25 a month. She's an active participant in all the groups, gets to download all the back classes and everything. And she gets to know that the podcast keeps coming right at her earbuds each month. And she's a part of bringing it to you and all the thousands of people who listen. So bump, Cynthia. And Joseph. Do you want to guess his last name? Joseph Zwick. That's how I pronounced it. Joseph Zwick. If my last name was Zwick, I think I would go by that. I'd be like, they're like, hey, are you Trippa? No. You can just call me Zwick, or Zwickenbacher, or Zwickalicious, or Zwickest, or Zwickalicka-licky-licky. Okay, maybe not the last one, but I would definitely go by Zwick. I'd be like, you could call me Dr. Zwick. Well, Zwick, thank you for joining the Homebrewed Christianity community. You are a deacon, a real full-fledged deacon. I appreciate it. Not just me, my family appreciates it because, well, it's how we pay the bills. And all the people that are listening that don't are at this point, they're a member of the community, like giving every month, that kind of thing. They appreciate it. I know some people who want to tell you thank you, but it's my two dogs. They're sitting at my feet. They said, "Roo." And I said, no, you can't bark on the podcast. And they're, "Roo," which in dog is like, tell Zwick thank you. So Pebbles and Dino want to be like, "Roo," which to Zwick. Or the Zwickinator. Or Zwickalicious. Thank you. If you want to support the podcast, be a part of the community, get all the perks, go to homebrewedcommunity.com. And here is my friend Timothy. Yeah. And guess what? I'm staying up late tonight because I'm going to watch some Lakers game. Because I'm on the East Coast now. And, if you're a student at Elon University or know someone, tell them to take my class this Jan term. I was told it's already full. But I don't know. I'm teaching class on secular apocalypse from, across all pop culture and stuff like that. It's going to be fun. But if you're in the community, if you're in the homebrew community, I'm sure you'll get audio of some sweet lectures and videos and stuff because it's been a lot of work preparing for it. And I'm going to share it with my friends. All right, peace. This is Timothy Murphy. Enjoy. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and today on the podcast is my friend Timothy Murphy, who also has a brand new book and is working on a whole nother book. This book that we're talking about is Counter-Imperial Churching for a Planetary Gospel. I know what you're saying. That probably involves footnotes. It does, but Counter-Imperial Churching for a Planetary Gospel. Timothy Murphy, we became friends at we were youth ministers at a retreat. Was the first time we hung out. And then since then, he cut his long, luscious hair and got a PhD. But
my hair's still on the long side, but yes.
I know, but it used to be long. And this book it's from Process Century Press and is part of the rather significant process theology book giveaway we're doing right now, where 5 different people are going to get 20 different books. And then the grand prize winner, on top of getting all 20 books that came out this past year from Process Century Press, they're also going to get 5 from John Cobb and Marjorie Suhaki and David Ray Griffin. So if for some reason you don't love process theology, tell your process theology loving friends. But I assume a lot of people that listen to this podcast need to get on and make sure you enter to win, because then you can have Timothy right there in your hands like this. I was showing Timothy holding his book. But
whether it's that book or another, it should be a great deal getting those books. People should totally sign up for that.
Oh yeah. So, but like maybe a place to begin in talking about this book is why don't you tell me, as someone who was working in the church and stuff, like when it was you were driven to both invest in a PhD, this academic quest, and also that the first book that comes out of it is one that is intricately connected to on the ground social movement and activism.
Great. Well, I struggled for a while about whether I was going to get a PhD at all because my commitments are varied, and what drew me to do the PhD at Claremont was that I was told quite explicitly that I could connect different things together, that it wasn't just becoming an expert in one very, very narrow thing, though I suppose I am in a way in process philosophy and constructive theology, but I was able to connect it with these interests of social justice, of politics, of church. And what the question that always has kind of driven me, that the question that brought me to that degree, and that's one of the central ones in the book, is how is it that what affects one directly affects all indirectly? When one suffers, all suffer. How is that not just a beautiful metaphor? How is that really true? And how is it specifically that persons with relatively more privilege or power in our world, how is it in their interest to work to dismantle systems and institutions that oppress and marginalize others? How is that part of their own healing? And so that was kind of the initial starting point, and it's one of the things I thought process would help in. And so I've kind of went in that direction, and in the process developed a way of thinking about church with some of those questions in mind. There were other questions, particularly around conflict. You know, the churches I've grown up in, I know probably many listeners are maybe what you call recovering evangelicals, perhaps. Mm-hmm. I never had that experience. I am from a mainline Protestant tradition, Christian Church Disciples of Christ, also Presbyterian somewhat in college. So the issue I always had was an avoidance of conflict. Like we all, in my tradition, Disciples of Christ, we all want to, love each other, and we're one, we're on the table. And what that meant in practice sometimes is that we're not going to look at things that might lead to controversy or division. Mm-hmm. So growing up, it was, in my college, the Iraq War. And, it's kind of an important thing, but we're not going to talk about it or reflect on what the gospel has to say about that. And so I kind of revolted against that notion of, well, it's kind of each individual, so we're not going to say anything. And it's like, no, the gospel's got to address these problems. If it means anything, it's got to address the problems in the world. And so that is a major theme in the book, and it comes out of those experiences of that not being done particularly well. Well,
in early in the book, you kind of talk about the different theories people have for this. You call it mainline malaise, or the disengagement and lack of energy in the mainline tradition, and I wonder if there's if part of what you're saying is how the congregations have this tendency to avoid conflict, then they actually, are happy to talk about, justice topics that probably don't demand a whole lot from us, aren't that costly, and 90% of the people in the room are already on board. And so
yes, an example of that would be traditionally progressive Christian congregations that are, strongly on board LGBT rights. Mm-hmm. They're maybe kind of broadly environmentally friendly and affirm we need to cooperate with other religious traditions. But when you start talking about race and class, things get really quiet very quickly.
So, in what were some of the experiences you had when you were working with Progressive Christians Uniting that, which you could say a bit about that just who they are, but what in that experience of working as an executive director there made you think that part of what needs to be addressed is a robust ecclesiology, which is what you're doing in the book?
Well, I would say that the order's slightly backwards in that I'd written the dissertation before working at Progressive Christians Uniting, but in my time at Progressive Christians Uniting, I revised it into a book and took the lessons that I had in other experiences and saw them more broadly at Progressive Christians Uniting to flesh out and add some more practical content into the book. But I would say Progressive Christians Uniting is a volunteer-based organization in Southern California of 100 congregations, maybe about 3,000 supporters of the newsletter that affirm that living out the way of Jesus in solidarity with others for the sake of social justice is what it means to be a Christian today. And so we had different programs and projects that sometimes connected very well with our base, other times didn't connect very well. So there were projects that we had, like on racialized mass criminalization, that we had a lot of coordination with our secular partners, with interfaith partners, with policy people, but also it was sometimes difficult to engage the traditional base that hasn't fully wrestled with the legacy of racism and white supremacy. And those are the very things in the book that I say is like, that's like the key spiritual practice for like white Christians needs to be working on dismantling and divesting of their privilege. You work on that. You know, there might be other spiritual practices you care about, but you do that one. That's up there. That's a priority. And that's still something that people struggle with. I'm also an anti-racism trainer in my denomination and led a workshop or co-facilitated a workshop a couple weeks ago. And it's just hard. That's not something that people want to address. And I think the very things that we don't want to address are sometimes the most important things that we need to address to be faithful to the gospel.
Mm-hmm. So when you, early in the book, you actually develop a cosmology, and then the cosmology ends up shaping, or in a sense nesting, your process ecclesiology. Can you describe that? Well, one, I guess it makes sense why a process person would think cosmology serves that function, but that's not normal for ecclesiologies. So what was kind of underneath that decision to begin there?
I mean, part of it was, it's twofold. One is about thinking about, because I want to talk about churching and the gospel from very concrete perspectives and not from a pure kind of universal abstract position that then gets applied. Mm-hmm. I need to have find general patterns in which these different formations overlap. So it's a bit like Whitehead's insight that how do specifics come out of universals? In no way. You only get the universals out of those specific instantiations. And so I find that's kind of how I'm using process. And I found that general pattern in terms of gospel, as I see it or have experienced it, always involves something along the lines of things are valuable for themselves on their own terms, are valuable for others, and are valuable for the world. Like mm-hmm. every example of where I've seen like a life-giving gospel reflects that pattern. And then secondarily on the cosmology, it's because I'm so focused on planetary problems and the world, people can go, well, where's God? Where's the divine here? So I need to also show how God is engaged or a part of or in relation with our world, so that when I'm talking about the world and these problems and their transformation, at the same time, even if I'm not using the G word, I'm talking about God. Mm-hmm. So I say I have that stuff at the beginning, and then at the end I go, and we could speculate more, but I really want to focus more empirically on our challenges and world and reflect from that end. But for me, process is a tool.
Yeah.
That I have different questions than I'd say the general process thinker, because they're much more liberationist or looking at power. But process can be a very helpful tool for me to reflect on those relationships and avoid certain patterns that I find problematic in other discourses around liberation and counter-imperial ethos.
Mm-hmm. So say a bit then about how you understand planetary gospel. I imagine if you Googled it, it's probably conservative evangelicals' way to like get Bibles translated to every part of the planet or something like that was what pops up. So what is a planetary gospel proclaiming?
Yes. So in a way, I mean, I can make analogies that are imperfect, but the one aspect is that the planetary gospel is a reworking, in a way, an expansion of social gospel, mm-hmm. that the gospel responds to those problems. But the real question, I guess, is what is planetary? And when you think of planetary, you often think of, I think I have this quote on, page 54. Do you mind if I read?
Go for it.
When some people hear planetary, we think instantly of planet Earth. We think of trees, animals, and far off distant places. These are the planetary, but so is the ground beneath your feet. It's the apartment complex you dwell in and the neighbors that live there too. It's the utterly human of human existence, and it's the depths of the sea. It's matter itself and its lived experience. So it's planetary is both, it's not global. That's like one of the key things. So mm-hmm. when you think of a globe, you think of maybe like looking at the earth from like a far distance away, or maybe a globe sphere that you hold in your hands. It's like this abstract, distant thing, but the planetary is more from looking from the soil up. So it's very rooted and in your context, but your context is also all those relationships that make you who you are and those contexts. So it's the whole as well, but it's the whole from your position. And so likewise, the gospel has to respond to those challenges and what I call the bad news in our world, because gospel just means good news. And if it doesn't respond to bad news, it's just information. Mm-hmm. So if good news that responds to very concrete challenges, but also connects beyond those horizons with others, is what I mean by kind of planetary gospel. And so that will look differently in different locations. So I give examples throughout the book. And if you're in a different social location, you go, that's not the gospel in my location. And I would go, yep, that's right. But how does the gospel in your location connect in that way? And so then we can look for those larger patterns. So mm-hmm. I'm trying to avoid a single universal gospel that then gets applied, because I don't like that approach of the one pluralizing, or like this universal that then gets applied. I'm trying to avoid that while still having the relationship and accountability of difference.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people first encounter the weight or the oppressive weight of a kind of singular universalized gospel when in order for you to encounter someone that's significantly different in a lot of different ways, you have a missiology that has to abstract that person from their situation, so you can then give them, the one version of the gospel you think is most trustworthy or accurate. And the notion of planetary in contrast to global missions, but planetary missions, recognizing the kind of the universal and the particular is something I think you're even seeing people resonate with in more edgy evangelical missions movements and stuff like that, to start to think about what does the church look like in this neighborhood and in this location, mm-hmm. and this type of thing. One of the things you do that I think is super helpful at what in the world does that look like is in the way you talk about practicing differentiated solidarity in chapter 3. Like, for those who have this interest to go like, yeah, the gospel's good news, and it's good news to people in the difficulties, in the challenges and things they have in their actual lives and their situations and the social systems they participate in. What are the kind of creative principles of reflection that you develop to kind of help us put meat on that and not just figure out a new way of saying the same thing?
So when I think about solidarity, there's this very it's been effective for a long time, but it's got a lot of problems approach of trying to find sameness in each of us, that we're all fundamentally the same, or looking at past our differences, past et cetera, how are we all the same at our roots? And I find that to be a huge problem. So when I'm asking people to work in solidarity with those who are experiencing oppression or marginalization, I don't really want to go in the direction of we are the 99%. Like we're all in the same boat. We're all in this together, because the way we experience the world, the way the world sees us and treats us is different. And to flatten that out is a huge problem. So I give examples of around particularly like cross-cultural solidarity around racial justice. And like even the instinct of wanting to be an ally and yet demanding people share their stories of trauma right now so you can be a better ally itself can be an oppressive, dominating practice. And so just recognizing that even the desire to be in solidarity, when done, that can reflect those colonizing instincts that we don't want but are in us. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about with differentiated solidarity, that we are different, that we're really different, and we can yet relate. And I give like different practices around encounter and listening and those types of things.
Earlier you talked about the way you, as someone who grew up mainline, and you can be a part of progressive Christian churches, which if you go to their website, you're like, oh, you care about inclusion and justice and the planet and all this kind of stuff. But that the way those principles get brought into the community, we start to avoid the things that are super challenging or really make demands of us. And I'm wondering what these practices you described of trying to kind of undercut the safety blanket we put on our ideals by not really locating ourselves and recognizing difference and acknowledging the way it impacts things. Like, what are some of the practices in a faith community or that leaders can start to think through to address this?
Well, I think that one thing that congregations, even generally liberal or progressive congregations, often do is that they still have a fairly generic proclamation. So it might be God loves us and wants a just world and wants justice, and so we welcome everyone. That would be like a fairly kind of broad statement of value, but it really doesn't tell you anything about what does that mean, or what does that look like, or what are the relationships in your community, or what are the ways you are participating in domination that are hurting and devaluing people. So the whole approach is, when I talk about churching, because I will honestly admit that my audience is not primarily existing congregations. Like, they can take things from this, but there is it's not a manual of how to fix your congregation kind of thing. But there are tools that they can use, and one of them is to be really clear about what the problem is. What is the problem? What is the violation of value? What is the dehumanization that's happening? And if they can name that really clearly, they can name who it's impacting, and they can begin to listen to those who are most directly impacted, asking how can we learn from you? How can we support the work you're doing? Just for example, there is a group in Los Angeles called Stand LA, Stand Together Against Neighborhood Drilling, because there's no minimum distance between where oil drilling can happen and where residents can live. Yeah. So literally they can be literally next door. And so that means elevated asthma and sickness and cancer rates among children and the elderly, and threats to pregnant women. And that is itself the embodiment of structural sin, racism, and oppression. And the gospel in that context, to be faithful, responds to that and listens to those communities directly impacted to hear their witness and to reflect on where is the divine working in the struggle to end that. It needs to be that specific. Mm-hmm. And if it can name those problems, then it has a chance of naming what the good news is and find a way to be in solidarity with those who are most impacted as a koinonia fellowship of differentiated solidarity, which is kind of what I'm talking about with churching as an activity. It's not just the institution doing these things. It's like these activities themselves reflect the way of churching. That's kind of the point of where I'm trying to go with the book.
Well, you talk about the two quotes of yours, so I'm going to read you to you, that really connect to this. Is you said that, and this is when you're discussing the notion of a missional encounter, that it must also be a way to deconstruct the unjust internalized relationships of dominance that persist within us. That, especially as people of privilege, that part of engaging or churching or the activity of gospeling involves first this kind of deconstructive act and the recognition of internalized things that exist within us. And when we don't allow the encounter to be revelatory for you and not just the person you're quote proclaiming or witnessing or whatever to, then it creates then you persist in carrying on these internalized relationships of dominance.
That a classic example of that is when and it's not. I mean, there's many layers of oppression and privilege. So I don't want to think of it just in from a racial lens, but thinking from that lens, I can think of the example of white allies on racial injustice wanting to be supportive, but then demanding that they be able to be fully present in every gathering or meeting that others have been working on without a sense of trust or relationship, like saying, but I know my intentions. I know I want to do this good. So why won't you let me in? I have a right to be here now. And that those very types of things of I have the right to be here and I'm here to help themselves reflects, like, the intentions aren't bad, but they still reflect that kind of dominating sensibility. So we can talk about the divesting ourselves, but even the Gospels or the New Testament has a very clear image of this, which is kenosis. I mean, I'm really just talking about the spiritual practice of kenosis and decentering yourself in those types of relationships, especially when trust is minimal or if you're new to that kind of relationship. It's why would we ever think that it should be otherwise? Now, I'm not a kenosis universalist, right? That's what everyone should. That's the practice for everybody. So, but in that context, that can be a helpful practice and one that I think if we did that right, then we would be doing a lot more right.
Mm-hmm. In part of it, you unpack kind of later in the book the way our understandings or the way we even conceive of oppression, conflict, injustice, and things shapes what it is we see as kind of demanded by our ethical accounts, and that part of the challenge among progressive Christians is to reconceive of justice that isn't where it's not completely determined by like rights and distribution and these very Rawlsian dials.
Well, yes. I mean, there is it's the classic difference of not just how are things distributed. It's the question of who gets to decide that process of a distribution, or what are the ways in which that happens. And so I have a section on kind of political theory and political thought, and I kind of make John Rawls, who's the granddaddy of English political liberalism, kind of a poster child of something wrong that's reflected in mainline Protestants. And there's a number of things about it, but one of those issues is that the things that Rawls sometimes finds accidental to democracies, like sacrifice or violence, they're not just incidental accidents to those systems. And so even the American sense of patriotism and the way that like people are viscerally angry at NFL players kneeling during the national anthem reflects that there's this element of sacred, a sense of the sacred in national identity that can quite easily and often be an idol. And that's not something that mainline Protestants are very good at recognizing at all. You really kind of need the radical Reformation churches to help you see that. And there's more than a little bit of that sensibility in me. So I'm trying to help them see those things. And that's kind of like some of those conflicts that just seem to be unaddressable, like globalized capitalism. They're just in the U.S. context, it's very hard for congregations to see how that has anything to do with the gospel because of their location. It'd be like a citizen in Rome 2,000 years ago saying, look, we got problems regarding this and that in the city of Rome. Why should I care about what's happening in Palestine? That's not relevant to, but it's like, but you're in the center of empire. So it's constituting in ways you don't even understand about who you are.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that connects to later in the book. You said that like that element, you see how conflict and things take place in a Rawlsian account gets transferred into churches, and then churches fear conflict, for conflict means disunity and chaos, and so congregations are uncomfortable with this expression and they'll seek to curtail it. However, you argue conflict can be productive. Now, when you say that, you and I are friends with plenty of ministers that are now questioning your sanity, Timothy. You know what I mean? Like, conflict can be productive. Say what? So kind of like unpack for us how conflict is something other than a good way to lose enough congregants to pay for our retirement plan.
Yeah, it is certainly the case that I'm using that word differently than its more kind of pejorative meanings in our popular culture. I'd say popularly and in kind of casual use, conflict means people disrespecting, not trusting, and questioning each other's values and motives around some issue. So it's always a fragmentary event that of people not listening to each other. And so that would be, I would say, antagonistic conflict, where it's kind of us versus them, or our side, their side. But there's this other notion of conflict as a passionate struggle, as a agonistics, not antagonistic, but of that sense of eros, of wrestling with things. That conflict as more conflict, like Jacob and God wrestling. It's of that leads to a greater growth or a greater sense of something. But if you don't go through that process, then you miss opportunities for something greater to emerge beyond itself. So I don't mean by conflict, I mean respectful listening and sharing, but of naming things that maybe will be controversial, like, hey, maybe we shouldn't say the Pledge of Allegiance in worship. For example, I mean, that's going to be a conflict because you're going to have people who identify, maybe their parents or grandparents, veterans, and there's a strong connection between God and the flag and U.S. and Jesus. So it's going to be a conflict, but it's something that it's theoretically possible to have something that's a better sense of who God is, who we are, and what kind of mission we have. So that will be conflictual. There will be disagreement, but it is possible to go through that process and come to something better. But the problem for liberal Protestants so often is we're so scared of it that we won't even do that wrestling. We won't wrestle with each other or God.
Yeah, in the wrestling, I think is kind of a form of disentangling. Like without the wrestling, then we won't disentangle our congregations, our life, our values, and these things from the ever-present, latent yet unacknowledged assumptions that it's for you describe it as this is necessary for that counter-imperial move.
Yes, that's that's completely right. So I just want to affirm what you said there.
Well, I don't know. I'm just telling you what I read in your book. So, and
I'm just saying, I agree with what you said.
You're like, you know what? Read some more myself. Cause whenever you do that, I just want to say, yeah. One of the things,
no, I mean, okay, I can say this one thing is that, somewhere else, I quote, George Pixley saying, the way that we can divide Christianity between those who believe that it has to respond to the deep injustices and oppression in our world and those who ignore or are complicit in it. And I really think that's right. And I really do think, those assumptions come out of my own kind of liberationist assumptions. First comes in some ways the experience of witnessing gross injustice and that moral revulsion at it and a desire to respond. And then comes our, faith reflection and practice and in that kind of circle of growth. But if we can't wrestle with those things, we can't see those dynamics, or if we're like, yeah, that's not really why we're here at church, then I don't know what to do with that. That's not why I'm a follower of Jesus. That's just not what I'm about. And that's why I also sometimes say, sometimes it's better to just form new communities that are on board with that commitment from the get-go. Because I know there's a lot of congregations, communities, and I know from experience from people I know who were transformational ministers. Their job was to help transform congregations. And when they got there, people were being asked to be church for a reason different than why they gathered in the first place. And so they're like, why would I want to be part of that? That's not why I'm here. And people kind of hit their heads against concrete walls for a while. So it's certainly possible for a congregation to transform. I don't dispute that. I just think sometimes the energy levels required is not always good, or it's not the gifts of a person to say, hey, I'm going to do that, as opposed to say, this is what we're about, who we are, and now we're going to discover how better to do that. But if you can't have that conversation, I don't know what to do if you can't even have the conversation.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I thought of in when reading the chapter where you kind of engage and critique a number of different theologians' ecclesiologies is I wonder, like, especially if people haven't read them all, like what are the consistent frustrating tendencies that systematic theologians when they start talking about the church, like where you go, oh, don't do that, and then they do it, and you're like, well, I guess I know how this book's going to end.
Yes. So when they try to describe, when they try to come up with some universal essence of the church, I'm already, like, my red flags and warning signals are going off, because
You're telling me that someone with the word churching in their title gets creeped out by universal essences? No way.
Yes, absolutely. That is definitely the case. And so, they can have great content. So, I give, Jürgen Moltmann a pretty hard time in what that chapter I think you're referring to. And there's aspects of it I love. I really like, he has a sense of the church as a place of mission. He has the sense of remembering what Jesus has done and anticipating, the coming kingdom, and this pretty strong, like, solidarity witness with church. So that all that stuff is like, yeah, thumbs up. I'm with you, Moltmann. But it's just when he has to, like, fit everyone into this one paradigm, is where it becomes really problematic for me. So one thing I play with is the marks of the church. So like if you're a doctrinal, if you follow kind of church doctrine, the church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. And those are really kind of like just a given. You can't question that. You can reinterpret them, and Moltmann and others interpret them in some pretty great ways. But the question for me is, why are those the unquestioning marks? Because they each have a shadow side so one always has to overwhelm the many, as opposed to looking at how are we many and different and yet connected. So, I mean, kind of looking at it from that inverse side. So instead of one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, I play with churches, many, secular, particular, and novel. But not just a complete reversal, but as those two, one and many, holy and secular, in relationship with each other, but rhetorically using the underside of that process, where people say, "Oh, we're united in our diversity," or it's a unity but not uniformity. Okay, fine. I mean that's fine, but it still leads to this kind of one perspective that's kind of dominating everything else in its application, which I just kind of wince at. And then, the other thing is when, especially with Moltmann, where he takes this idea that Christ suffers, there's great injustice in the world, and so the church, to be apostolic, must suffer. Like, it must suffer. And that is very different than saying, because the world is unjust and we are faithful to the gospel, suffering is probably going to happen.
Yeah.
That's very, very different than like, yeah, it's going to happen versus it needs to happen in order to show that you are church. I mean, that's probably like the worst example of that. And all I needed to do is change a few words, but those few words change everything in terms of what we need. Suffering's a good thing now. That was the most problematic. And then that comes also out of my process understandings of, evil, like those theodicy types questions of it's all for a greater purpose, or it's all worth it. No, resurrection can just be a bad thing. It's a bad thing, but there's a response later.
Mm-hmm. So if you got tasked, let's say the disciples of Christ, you grew up there, they're like, look, Timothy, we need your help. We need you to church plant a new church plant for us. We're gonna give you all the support and everything, but we have no idea what we should do. But we were hoping you were going to go churching for a planetary gospel in a counter-imperial type of way. So if you were sitting there and tasked with not inheriting a congregation or something, where like, how would you imagine beginning, organizing, and thinking through the process of churching?
Well, I in some ways don't have to imagine it, because I've seen examples of it, not ones that I personally organized, but there is a congregation here in the LA area called Urban Mission in Pomona that started very much by saying, we want to listen to the community and their needs and respond to those first. And it was primarily a working class, poor Latino area in Pomona. And, they didn't have worship for 6 months because they determined that the things that were needed were different. And so they had a minister doing reentry work for formerly incarcerated people. They had someone doing eco gardens because of food deserts in that area. And then over time, they expanded and had worship and those pieces. So it really is church as mission center. So having that really clear sense of mission, that I think that embodies a lot of what I was discussing and offering in the book. my own sensibilities have a strong, I don't know if the right word is, but lure towards forms of intentional community. But there's like very different forms of intentional community. But I would be inclined to form something like that, but I would need enough money to be able to buy a small apartment complex so everyone had their own space as well. Because I think everyone should, have their own bathroom. Not every intentional community has that, but
oh yeah. So when you think of our kind of contemporary context and what's going on in and outside of the church, what are the places you point at and you're like, they're a churching?
I mean, I see it in lots of different small. I see aspects of it in lots of different small ways. So I gave the example of, again, churching as much an activity of expressing those values and living out the way of Jesus, even if someone hasn't explicitly identified it as the way of Jesus in a way, because I think part of the work of church is to point to where we see God at work, even if others wouldn't use that language themselves. And I give an example of Black Lives Matter as one of those examples where it's done particularly well. And that's because churching has this threefold practice of proclaiming good news, connecting in relationship across difference, and resisting evil. Mm-hmm. And it's very clear that, I think that the whole debate that happened really last year, that was this like Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter debate, really reflects also that sense of like the planetary gospel of being specific in light of the problems. And it is true from a ontological, cosmological perspective that all lives matter. Goodness, I said all things are valuable for themselves, others, and the world. But contextually, the problem is not that all are devalued from the lens of racial injustice. It's that particularly Black persons and bodies are devalued. And so having a very specific good news, like, no, the world says you're not valuable. Yes, Black lives matter. And connecting across difference of gender and sexuality and orientation and class, which Black Lives Matter does very well. They are themselves a differentiated solidarity across difference that resists systemic state violence in terms of police forces. So in that way, it fits that pattern perfectly, but it's also an implicit version of it because it's not doing that in the name of Jesus. And I don't require them to do that. But I think you need someone to point to where we see that divine activity at work explicitly. And there's a role for the kind of explicit ecclesial formulations beyond spiritual social movements. Those spiritual social movements is a large part of where I see this work happening on a ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm. So when you're when you encounter people in your kind of activism, community organizing, and that type of work, and they're like, "Oh, you did a PhD in theology, so what do you think about God?" Like, how do you kind of begin and start describing your Christian faith and personal commitment in ways that one, they can hear without having hung out with Whitehead for a long time, but also trying to differentiate yourself from the parts of the church that they see kind of resisting what your shared values are there together?
It's funny because even the way the question's framed, it assumes certain the way that people ask questions a certain way. And what I found is that no one has asked me once in my years of activism how I understand God. They want generally to know, why am I there? And what does this have to, and what kind of Christian am I? Are the types of questions. And generally those are not people are not asking me to bare my soul. They really just want to know, am I safe to be around? And mm-hmm. and the quick answer is to go, for most people, it works to say, oh, I'm a Christian who affirms LGBT rights and believes that working against racism and ecological devastation is what the gospel's about. And they go, oh, wow, I didn't know there were Christians like that. And then you kind of move on to the work. People generally don't ask the follow-up questions of, well, how do you understand God that can justify those conceptions? I mean, so it's more pragmatic in terms of how you interact with people. It's more about the trust levels. But I'm happy to talk with people about how I understand God and that I know through Jesus and those values as expressed in why I do what I do, which is kind of what I preach on as a interim minister at a congregation, that it's very much about living out the way of Jesus. And as Paul rightfully translated would say, we are saved by the faithfulness of Jesus, or we are made righteous by the faithfulness of Jesus, and participating in that and in his vision and God's vision of a redeemed and healed and liberated world. So if some people want to know why I'm there, I can say, well, I mean, I care about this particular issue, but also why does it matter to me that it's part of my own healing, that I live in a city that everyone has a chance to breathe and not be choked by pollution, for example.
So in that decision of wondering, well, should I even go in to get a PhD and then spending time working in organizing with churches and things in Los Angeles. If you think back 7 or 8 years ago, what were the biggest insights or things gained in the process you've gone through to get to this point that you didn't really anticipate?
I think that I think I really grew a lot in the PhD program, both in terms of my sense of, it deepened my own sense of call. It was consistent with that. I'm not a born again Christian. I'm either a once born or a born again and again and again and again Christian, where you kind of gain these insights and new ways of seeing things, and it helps you grow in deeper ways. But I did not have any philosophy background going into my PhD program, and not that I use it every day. I tend to use kind of applied philosophy, but it helped me look at things a little less dogmatically, even from like a process perspective. If you want to get nerdy, I was an Ogdenite going in, and then became more of a Kellerite afterwards. And those are different for like the process nerds. Those are pretty different. Though I'm not poetic at all like Keller, and I add more power analysis than she tends to emphasize in her work. So I certainly changed that way. And I'm certainly less dogmatic. Everyone, you can think yourself progressive, but you still have like certain dogmatic assumptions. And I think that would be like theologically the biggest shift for me coming out, and then even a greater appreciation and engagement with the liberation theologies that I had some engagement with, and I had like justice concerns, but not really like the methodology of how do we do theology.
Right.
And that really, that method is my method now. And I use Keller's cosmology for those ends of reimagining church. That did not exist before I came here. So it helped me that I had a really clear sense of what I wanted to get out of a PhD program, and that it wasn't something of, well, I just want to learn and explore. And I had things I needed to do. It was for a purpose, and it helped me kind of get through and get to work. And that's kind of the way I kind of approach it. And I found that to be very helpful. Of course, probably not great for the job market. It's almost impossible to get a full-time tenure track. I wouldn't suggest anyone go for the sake of career advancement per se.
Yeah, that's, but there's nothing quite like, getting a PhD so you can apply for entry-level jobs that are half of what you got paid as a minister. Because
half, wow, that would be great if it was half.
Well,
no. So So I certainly, so I mean, as the executive director or former executive director of Progressive Christian Journey, I did not need a PhD to do that work, but the things I learned helped me ask questions I maybe wouldn't have asked otherwise. So, I mean, that was helpful, and to see certain patterns that I wouldn't have recognized otherwise. So for me, it's been very valuable. I have no regrets that I did it. It gives me the opportunity to teach part-time as well, and I very much enjoy that. I've always felt that my own call is at the intersection of teaching, church engagement, and social justice.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, if I can do those three things, I'm happy. And so I'm doing them in part-time, small-scale things. So, part-time, interim minister, teach one class a semester, and a lot of social justice activism and solidarity work where I bring a faith lens and apply this. And so sometimes I find that the things I learned are most appreciated by my fairly secular colleagues who used to be religious, felt like Christianity wasn't really addressing these things. And they go, "Oh, really? I never realized you could do that." And yeah, could you pray for me?
Yeah,
sure. Okay. And so that I like that a lot.
Well, I want you to know it was great to have you on the podcast, and it's always fun to have people on the podcast who I'm friends with in real life. And
yes.
So yeah, and if people are wanting to connect with you and all the different work you're doing, like where should we point them? This is me telling you should have a website. That's what it basically.
I know. And I looked at that, and it was like websites cost $3,000 to $4,000, and I was like, how do I make that work? So I do not yet have a website, but I have obviously Facebook, so people can connect with me there. Timothy Murphy, and then I'm on Twitter, not as much as others are, but my handle there is at Radical Witness.